I want you to picture the exact moment my husband realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He was standing in a conference room we built together, in a business we built together, holding a piece of paper his own lawyer had just handed him. His hands were shaking so bad, the paper made this soft little rattling sound, and I remember thinking in that moment how strange it was that 7 years of marriage could end with a sound that quiet. 6 months before that day, Mark told me he wasn't happy anymore. He said it over dinner on a random Tuesday, like he was telling me the dishwasher was broken. 26 days later, I found out the real reason he wasn't happy. Her name was Kayla. She was 26 years old. She was our company's marketing coordinator, and she'd been in my house wearing my husband's t-shirt since before he even had the decency to move his toothbrush out. He thought he was walking away with the business, the house, and the girl. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I don't get mad, I get organized. And by the time Mark was standing in that conference room, shaking, staring at a forensic accounting report with his name circled in red 23 separate times, he finally understood something I'd known for months. I wasn't the woman he left. I was the woman who was about to take everything back. Stay with me tonight, because to understand how a broken dishwasher comment turned into that shaking piece of paper, I have to take you back to the beginning, back to the version of me who thought for better or worse actually meant something to both of us. Hey, welcome back. If you're new here, I'm the one telling you tonight's story, and I promise you this one gets so much worse before it gets better. There's a discovery coming about 35 minutes in that even I didn't see coming while I was living it, and trust me, you don't want to walk in late to that part. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. My name doesn't matter for tonight's story. What matters is that I was 31 years old, 7 years into a marriage, and I genuinely believed I had built the life I was supposed to have. I met Mark at a small business expo of all places, back when I was trying to get my home staging side hustle off the ground, and he was working as an operations manager for a chain of local coffee shops. We started talking about foot traffic patterns of all things, and somehow that turned into 2 hours of conversation and a phone number written on the back of his expo badge. I remembered thinking, walking back to my car that night, that I'd just met someone who actually listened when I talked about my business plans, instead of politely nodding along the way most of the guys I dated before him had. He texted me before I even got home, something simple like, "That was the best conversation I've had in months," and I remember smiling at my phone in a parking lot like a teenager. It's strange, looking back now, how much of the beginning still feels completely real to me, even knowing everything I know about how it ended. For the first few years, Mark was steady in a way I'd never had before. He wasn't flashy, wasn't dramatic. He was the guy who fixed the leaky faucet without being asked, who remembered my coffee order was oat milk with 1 pump of vanilla, who showed up early to every single one of my staging jobs to help me carry furniture, even after a full day at his own job. When my business started to actually take off, he was the one who suggested we combine forces, take my design eye and his operations brain, and open something together. I want to spend a little more time here, in the good years, because I think it matters that you understand exactly what I believed I had before I tell you what it actually was. Mark used to leave handwritten notes tucked into the pastry case at the flagship location on slow mornings just for me to find. Dumb little things like, "You built this, don't forget that," or a badly drawn coffee cup with a heart on it. I kept a small box of those notes for years. I haven't been able to throw them away, even now, though I did finally move it out of the house. He drove 3 hours round trip once during our second year of dating just to bring me soup and cold medicine when I was too sick to leave my apartment and had a big staging consultation the next morning I was terrified of missing. He learned to make my grandmother's pot roast recipe specifically so he could surprise my parents with it the first time they came to visit our new house. Those aren't the actions of someone who never cared, and that's actually one of the hardest parts of this whole story to reconcile, even now. Mark wasn't a cartoon villain for the entire 7 years. For long stretches, he was genuinely present, genuinely thoughtful, genuinely someone I trusted completely. That's what made everything that came later so disorienting. It wasn't that I'd been foolish the whole time. It was that someone capable of real tenderness turned out to also be capable of this. That's how The Little Fig was born, a small cafe/design studio hybrid. My idea originally, his execution. We poured everything into that place, our savings, our weekends, honestly, most of our 20s. Within 4 years, we'd opened a second location. People in town used to point us out. That's the couple who built the Little Fig from nothing. I used to love hearing that. I thought it meant we were unshakable. I remember the night we signed the lease on the second location like it was yesterday. We sat in the empty, unfinished space with a bottle of cheap champagne and 2 folding chairs. No furniture yet, just bare concrete floors and big plans. And Mark toasted to 20 more years of building things together. I still have a photo from that night on my phone, the 2 of us grinning in that empty room, and for a long time after everything fell apart, I couldn't bring myself to delete it. I finally did, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, and it felt less like erasing a memory and more like finally closing a door that had been swinging open in the wind for too long. Looking back now, there were things I should have noticed, the way there always are in stories like this. Little things that felt like nothing at the time, like how around year 5, Mark started going to the gym constantly. New gym, new trainer, new supplements lined up on the bathroom counter. I remember being genuinely happy for him. I thought, good, he's taken care of himself. We're getting older. This is healthy. I never once thought to ask why a man who'd worn the same 5 t-shirts for a decade suddenly cared this much about how his arms looked in a mirror. There was also Kayla. We hired her about 18 months before everything fell apart. Straight out of college, bright and eager, genuinely talented at social media in a way neither of us were. I liked her. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I actually liked her in the beginning. I remember training her myself on our brand voice, taking her to lunch during her first week to make her feel welcome, telling Mark how relieved I was we'd finally found someone who got our aesthetic. I remember the interview itself, actually, because I was the one who pushed to hire her over 2 other more experienced candidates. She'd brought a mock content calendar to the interview that she'd built entirely on her own time, using our actual public social media accounts as a reference. And I was so impressed by the initiative that I barely let Mark get a word in before I told her the job was hers if she wanted it. I used to joke in those early months that finding Kayla felt like finally getting the missing piece for our marketing. I had no idea how literally Mark would eventually take that phrase. I had no idea what that hire would come to cost me. By month 6 of Kayla working with us, I started noticing Mark handling more of the marketing meetings himself, which felt normal on the surface. He was, after all, the operations half of our partnership, and marketing touched operations constantly. What I didn't clock, not for a long time, was how many of those meetings happened after hours, or how often Mark started grabbing content shots with Kayla on the second location on evenings I wasn't scheduled to be there. I remember one specific night, I'd stopped by the second location around 8 p.m. to drop off a delivery, and I found the lights dim, music playing, Mark and Kayla laughing over what looked like a mocktail menu tasting. Nothing inappropriate on the surface, just 2 coworkers testing recipes, but I remember the way Mark's face changed the second he saw me in the doorway, just a flicker. a half second of something I couldn't name yet. I asked him about it in the car on the way home. He laughed it off, said they were behind on the seasonal menu launch, said Kayla had great flavor pairings, said I was being paranoid because I was stressed about the second location's slow Q3 numbers. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He'd never given me a reason not to in 5 years of marriage. I remember that car ride in more detail than I probably should, honestly. He reached over and took my hand at a red light, gave it a squeeze, and said, "You know you're the only one I'd ever want running this place with me, right?" I remember feeling reassured by it, genuinely warmed by it, the way you do when your husband says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. I didn't know yet that reassurance, when it comes on command like that, right after you've asked a question you weren't supposed to ask, is sometimes just another word for a well-rehearsed line. There's a moment from around this time I think about more than almost any other. It was our 6th anniversary. Mark had planned a nice dinner, gave me a bracelet, said all the right things. At one point during dinner, his phone buzzed on the table, screen lighting up just enough for me to catch a name, Kayla, and a preview of a message that said something like, "Can't wait for tomorrow. This is going to be so much fun." I remember exactly what the restaurant looked like that night. The little candle flickering between us, the string quartet playing somewhere near the bar, Mark's hand resting over mine while he talked about 6 more years and then 6 more after that. I remember thinking in that exact moment how lucky I was, even as his phone lit up 3 inches from my water glass with a message from a woman he was already planning tomorrow with. I asked what tomorrow was. He said it was a work thing, content shoot for the fall menu launch. I said, half joking, "You two are basically work spouses at this point." And he laughed a little too fast and changed the subject to the creme brulee. I want to pause here because I know some of you are already yelling at your screen. How did you not see it? And listen, I get it. From the outside, all of this reads like flashing neon. But when you've built a business and a marriage with someone for 7 years, you extend them a kind of trust that doesn't come with an expiration date automatically. I wasn't looking for reasons to doubt him. Why would I be? He was my husband. He was my business partner. He was, as far as I knew, the person who had my back more than anyone else on earth. There's another moment I have to mention from our staff holiday party that same year. We always closed the flagship location early on the Friday before Christmas and hosted a small gathering for our employees. Nothing fancy, just pizza and a gift exchange. I remember Mark and Kayla ending up as Secret Santa partners that year, a pairing decided by random draw, or so I believed at the time. Kayla's gift to him was oddly specific, a mug with an inside joke about the best content shoot days printed on it, something none of the rest of us understood, and Mark laughed a beat too long and too loud when he opened it in a way that made a couple of our other staff members exchange a quick, curious glance I noticed but brushed off as nothing. I found out much later, going through the messages, that the Secret Santa draw hadn't been random at all. Kayla had asked our office manager to specifically pair her with Mark, framing it as a joke about wanting to finally get him something he'd actually use. And our office manager, having no reason to suspect anything, had happily obliged. By month 9 of Kayla's employment, small shifts started happening that I could feel more than name. Mark started working out even more, buying new clothes he said were for client meetings, getting a haircut style he'd never asked for in 7 years. He started leaving his phone face down more often, a habit he'd never had before. When I asked about the second location's numbers, he got cagey in a way that didn't match the confident, detail-obsessed man I married. I also noticed Kayla pulling slightly closer to me during this stretch, oddly enough, inviting me to lunch, complimenting my design choices a little too enthusiastically, asking me questions about how Mark and I made a business partnership work as a married couple, that in hindsight feel almost cruel in their irony. I remember one lunch specifically. Kayla asked me point blank, "Do you ever worry about him meeting someone at work? Like with how much time you two spend on this business?" I laughed and said something like, "Mark's not really the type." She smiled and said, "That's so nice that you trust him like that," and ordered another iced tea. I've replayed that lunch in my head more times than I can count. There's one more moment from this stretch of time I have to mention because it's the one that, looking back, feels almost unbearably obvious now. About 2 months before the Tuesday dinner that changed everything, Mark told me he needed to attend a 2-day regional coffee industry conference a few hours away, alone, since it fell during one of my busiest staging weeks and I couldn't get away. I remember being a little disappointed I couldn't join him, but I encouraged him to go, even helped him pack, even joked about him networking hard while he was there. I found out months later, going through those old credit card statements, that there was no regional conference that weekend. There was instead a 2-night stay at a boutique hotel 40 minutes from that same town, booked under Mark's name, with a second charge for a couple's spa package processed the following morning. I don't know exactly when Kayla told her own parents she was going away with coworkers that weekend, but I know now with total certainty that the man I helped pack a suitcase for wasn't attending a single seminar the entire time he was gone. Then came the Tuesday. Nothing about that day was special. We'd closed up the flagship location, come home, ordered Thai food, and were sitting at our kitchen island when Mark set down his fork and said, "I need to talk to you about something." I remember my stomach dropping instantly, the way it does when you already sense something is coming, even before the words arrive. He said he wasn't happy anymore. He said he'd been feeling disconnected for a while. He used the phrase, "we've grown apart," which I remember thinking, even in the moment, sounded like a line from a script rather than something he'd actually thought through himself. He didn't mention Kayla, not that night. He framed it entirely as something wrong with us, with our marriage, with the natural erosion of two people who'd spent too many years grinding on a business instead of nurturing a relationship. I cried. I asked what I could do differently. I offered date nights, counseling, a vacation, anything. He said he needed space to figure things out and moved into our guest room that same night. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into trying to fix something I didn't yet understand was already unfixable. I booked us a weekend getaway to a cabin 2 hours out of town, which he canceled 2 days beforehand, citing work stress. I found a couples counselor with decent reviews and sent Mark her website, which he said he'd look into and never did. I started cooking his favorite dinners again, the way I had in our first year together, watching him eat them politely at our kitchen island before retreating to the guest room right after. And I remember thinking, even then, how strange it was that a man who claimed to be confused about his feelings seemed so completely certain about wanting distance. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, the way I had to sit with it for weeks afterward. A woman lying awake in her own bed, genuinely believing her husband was going through some kind of internal crisis, offering to fix a marriage she thought was simply worn down by stress and time, with absolutely no idea that 20 minutes away in an apartment I didn't even know existed yet, someone else was waiting for him. But what happened next, I never saw coming. Because 6 weeks after that Tuesday dinner, I was going to find out exactly how long grown apart had actually been a lie, and exactly whose name had been quietly written into my future the entire time. 6 weeks after that Tuesday dinner, Mark still hadn't moved out. He was still in our guest room, still coming to the cafe every day, still acting like a man figuring things out. I was still, God help me, trying to fix something I didn't yet understand was already broken beyond repair. The night everything changed started with something as mundane as printer paper. Our home office shared a small filing cabinet where we kept both personal and business paperwork, a system Mark himself had set up years earlier because he liked things organized his way. I went looking for a specific vendor invoice one night, something about a delayed espresso machine shipment, and instead of the folder I expected, I found a slim manila envelope tucked behind our business tax files, labeled in Mark's handwriting, "Personal, do not file." I remember standing in that home office in my pajamas, holding that envelope, feeling the exact temperature of the room seem to drop around me, the way it does right before you already know something is about to change permanently. I want to tell you that I hesitated before opening it. I didn't. Some instinct in me, the same instinct I think that had noticed the perfume-free but somehow still wrong nights, the phone flipped face down, the too quick laugh at dinner, told me this envelope was the answer to a question I hadn't let myself ask directly yet. Inside was a lease agreement, a one-bedroom apartment across town signed 4 months earlier, Mark's name on it, and a second name, Kayla's. I sat on the floor of our home office for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes staring at that lease, doing math in my head over and over. 4 months. 4 months before that Tuesday dinner where he told me he needed space to figure things out. He already had an apartment. He already had someone in it. I kept digging that night, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I found credit card statements he'd been keeping separate from our joint account, a business expense card he used for vendor entertainment that included, among other things, a weekend hotel stay in Napa I had zero memory of us discussing, a jewelry store charge for something that was definitely not for me, and a recurring monthly charge to a florist that had never once sent flowers to our house. I want to describe the exact moment I found the florist charge because it's the one that broke something open in me differently than the others. It was a small recurring amount, $28 a month, tagged in the statement simply as office plant maintenance. I remember thinking at first that it was probably some legitimate expense for the flagship location's front window display. Then I noticed the billing address on the charge, not our business address, but a residential address I didn't recognize. The same address, it turned out, listed on the lease I'd already found. $28 a month for over a year, quietly funding fresh flowers for an apartment I didn't know existed, delivered to a woman I trained on our brand voice with my own 2 hands. "I can't believe this" is the only phrase I remember repeating out loud to an empty room over and over, staring at that $28 line item, not because the amount was large, because of how small and routine it was, automated, recurring, quietly humming along in the background of our shared finances for over a year, completely beneath my notice. The same way, I realized, the entire second half of my marriage had apparently been humming along beneath my notice, too. I found texts, too, not on his phone, which he kept locked, but on our shared laptop, logged into an old cloud backup from before he switched phones 8 months earlier, that neither of us had ever bothered to disable. Messages going back almost a year, messages that made it very clear this hadn't started 6 weeks ago or even 4 months ago with that lease. It had started while Kayla was still in her first 90 days of employment, while I was still training her on our brand voice, while I was still taking her to lunch to make her feel welcome. I found a message from Mark to Kayla dated the night of our 6th anniversary dinner, sent while I was in the bathroom, that said, "Tomorrow's going to be so worth the wait. I promise." I read that message probably 20 times, not because I didn't understand it, because I was trying to find a version of it that didn't mean what it obviously meant. There wasn't one. The sheer volume of it is hard to describe unless you've lived through something similar. It wasn't just a handful of damning texts. It was hundreds of messages spanning nearly a year, an entire parallel relationship running quietly underneath the one I thought I was living. There were good morning texts sent within minutes of the good morning texts Mark sent me. There were team dinners that were actually cover stories for hotel check-ins. There was an entire private nickname Mark had for Kayla that I'd never once heard him use out loud, tender and specific in a way that made my stomach turn because I recognized the rhythm of it. It was almost identical to the nickname he'd given me in our first year together, recycled like it had never meant anything the second time around. I also found a thread from the week of my father-in-law's hospital scare when Mark had told me he needed to stay late handling a vendor emergency instead of coming with me to the hospital. The messages from that same night were between him and Kayla planning what movie to watch together at the new apartment. I sat with that one for a long time because it wasn't just a betrayal of me anymore. It was a betrayal of an entire family who trusted him to show up when it mattered. I also found the thread from the day Mark bought me that anniversary bracelet, the one he gave me at the dinner where his phone buzzed with Kayla's name. The messages showed him asking Kayla earlier that same afternoon whether she thought I'd like the thin gold one or the one with the little charm, and Kayla responding with a heart emoji and "Get the charm one, it's more you." I sat with that thread the longest of all of them, I think, because it meant that even the small, sweet gestures I cherished during that final year hadn't fully belonged to just the two of us. Kayla picked out my anniversary gift. I'd worn it months, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of it, with no idea at all. I want to talk about what the rest of that night felt like because I think anyone who's lived through something like this knows there's a very specific kind of stillness that arrives before the full grief does. I didn't wake him up. I didn't scream into the guest room door. I sat on that office floor at nearly 2 a.m. and, almost on autopilot, started photographing every document, every statement, every message thread, working backward through almost a year of my own life like I was building a case file, because some quiet, clear-eyed part of me already understood I was going to need proof, not just for my own sanity, but for what was coming next. Around 3 a.m., I finally let myself cry, not the composed documentation kind of crying I'd been doing for the past hour, the kind where you can't catch your breath, where your whole chest feels like it's caving in. I called my older sister, who picked up on the second ring, even though it was the middle of the night, and I just said, "The apartment has her name on it, too," over and over because I couldn't get any other words out. I also called my mom the next morning, even though I hadn't slept at all. She didn't say much at first. She just listened to me get through the story in pieces, and then she said something I've held on to ever since. "You don't have to decide what you're doing about any of this today. Today, you just have to get through today." That sentence became a kind of anchor for me over the following days. I didn't have to know yet what I wanted to do about the business or the house or Mark. I just had to survive the next few hours and then the next few after that. I didn't confront Mark that night. I know some of you are already yelling at your screen, wondering why. Here's why. The second he knew I'd found the envelope, he and Kayla would have time to get their story straight, move money, hide accounts, delete messages. I'd already caught glimpses in those credit card statements of exactly how comfortable Mark had gotten moving money around without me noticing, and I had a very strong, very cold feeling that the affair wasn't the only thing hiding in that filing cabinet. So I waited. I backed up every document to 3 separate places, including a cloud folder Mark didn't have access to and a physical copy at my sister's house. I photographed the lease, the statements, the messages, and I quietly, calmly kept living in that house with him for another 11 days, smiling through dinners, nodding along as he talked about needing space while I built the most detailed financial and emotional timeline of my own marriage that I have ever created in my life. During that same stretch, I noticed our staff at the flagship location starting to whisper among themselves, the way people do when they sense tension between the two people who sign their paychecks. One of our longtime baristas asked me gently during a quiet afternoon shift if everything was okay between me and Mark, since he'd apparently been acting off for weeks. I told her we were just going through a rough patch, which was true in the most technical sense possible, and thanked her for checking in. I remember how strange it felt standing behind that counter, holding the full weight of what I knew while carefully managing the emotional temperature of an entire staff who had no idea their jobs were about to hang in the balance of a forensic accounting report. I can't believe this doesn't even begin to cover the dinner where Mark, 4 days after I found that envelope, looked me dead in the eye and said, "I think we should try counseling before we give up on this." I sat across from him, knowing exactly what apartment he was going to drive to the second he left our house. And I said, "Maybe you're right, let's think about it." I complimented the pasta he'd made. I asked about his day. I finally confronted him on day 12, not because I'd planned to on that specific day, but because Kayla made a mistake that flipped something in me permanently. I was at the flagship location, going through the marketing calendar, and I found a draft social media caption Kayla had accidentally saved to our shared brand account instead of her personal one. It was meant for an Instagram post announcing her own engagement to Mark, timed, based on the draft's scheduled date, for exactly 6 weeks after what would have been our divorce finalization. They'd already picked a date to announce their engagement before he'd even legally left me. "I can't believe this," was the only thought that would form in my head over and over, sitting there staring at a computer monitor, thinking about every single detail Kayla had apparently already planned out. The caption mentioned a specific ring style, a specific venue they were considering, even a joke about how some things are worth the wait. I remember feeling something shift inside me in that moment. Not sadness this time, but a kind of cold, focused clarity I hadn't felt since this whole thing started. 12 days of politely offering to fix a marriage that had already quietly been scheduled for its replacement. I drove home that night, and I didn't scream, didn't throw anything. I sat Mark down at the kitchen island, the same island where he'd first told me he wasn't happy, and I said, "I know about the apartment. I know the lease with her name on it. I know it's been going on since before her 90-day review, and I know you two have an engagement announcement already drafted." I watched his face do something I will never forget. It wasn't shock. It was the exact look of a man doing rapid math on how much I actually knew, trying to decide in real time which version of the truth might still be salvageable. He tried denial first. "It's not what it looks like. The apartment is just temporary. I was going to tell you when the time was right." I let him finish. Then I read him the date on the lease. I read him the anniversary night text. I told him about the engagement caption word for word because I had memorized it, exactly like I'd once memorized every sweet thing he'd ever said to me. He stopped denying about 30 seconds in. He switched almost instantly to justification. "I know this looks bad, but you and I both know we hadn't been the same in years. This business consumed everything. I just found something that felt easy again." I asked him one question that night that I don't think he had a rehearsed answer for. I asked, did the business fund any of this? The apartment, the hotel in Napa, the jewelry? He didn't answer right away. That silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard in 7 years of marriage. I asked him why, too, even though some part of me already suspected the answer wouldn't satisfy me. He said something about feeling invisible in our marriage, about how Kayla made him feel like the most interesting person in the room, about how he'd never meant for it to go this far. I sat with that explanation for a long moment before I said, "You didn't fall into this. You leased an apartment. You drafted an engagement announcement. That's not something that just happens to you." He didn't have an answer for that either. I think in that moment, some restless, hollow part of him had genuinely convinced himself that the affair was simply something that occurred to him, rather than something he'd built, brick by brick, over the better part of a year, using money and time that belonged to both of us. I asked him one more thing before I got up from that kitchen island. I asked if he'd ever actually planned to tell me the truth, or if he'd simply intended to let the divorce process run its course while I remained completely unaware of the apartment, the money, and the timeline. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, "I think I was hoping you'd just be so hurt about the divorce itself that you wouldn't dig into the rest of it." That sentence, more than anything else he said that night, told me exactly what kind of fight I was actually in. This was never going to be a simple, mutual, no-fault ending. He was counting on my heartbreak to keep me from looking too closely. I decided right then that I wasn't going to give him that. I want to take a second here because I know a lot of these stories jump straight to the screaming confrontation or the dramatic move out. That happened too. Mark moved into the apartment with Kayla's name on it within the week, which honestly made things simpler in some ways because I didn't have to look at him across the kitchen island every morning anymore. I remember the morning he actually left, watching him carry 2 suitcases out to his car, feeling strangely calm in a way that surprised me. I'd expected to feel devastated watching him go. Instead, I felt something closer to relief, the particular kind of relief that comes after weeks of performing normalcy in front of someone who was never being honest with you in return. I stood in the doorway and watched his car pull away, and then I went back inside and made myself a pot of coffee, alone, in a kitchen that finally felt like it belonged only to me. But the piece that turned this from a devastating discovery into an actual plan happened about 10 days after he moved out, when I sat down with our business's actual bank statements, not the personal card, the real business account, for the first time, with fresh eyes, no longer trusting a single line item Mark had ever explained away as routine. And that's when I found something that had nothing to do with heartbreak anymore and everything to do with fraud. I need to back up for a second, because what I found in those business bank statements deserves its own explanation, and because this is the moment the story stops being about a broken marriage and starts being about a plan. The Little Fig had 2 locations by that point, and Mark handled almost all of the day-to-day financials, vendor payments, payroll, the business expense card I mentioned earlier. I'd always trusted him with that side of things because operations was genuinely his strength and design was mine. That trust, it turned out, had been costing me a lot more than I realized. Going through 18 months of statements, line by line, I found a pattern of withdrawals labeled things like marketing consulting, vendor relations dinner, and equipment lease that didn't match any actual vendor, consultant, or piece of equipment I could find records for. When I cross-referenced the dates against the lease agreement, the Napa hotel charge, and the jewelry purchase, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Mark hadn't just been unfaithful with his time, he'd been funding an entire second life using money that belonged to both of us, and in several cases, using money that belonged to the actual company, the one with a legal structure, the one where borrowing money for personal use without documentation isn't just a marriage problem, it's a legal one. I want to be honest. For the first few days after finding this, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I wasn't building a plan yet. I was still in shock, still grieving, still waking up in an empty half of a bed I'd shared with someone for 7 years. I spent those first few days going through the motions at the flagship location, nodding along in staff meetings, smiling at regulars who had no idea their favorite coffee shop was quietly sitting on top of a landmine. I remember one specific morning during that stretch, standing behind the register during a slow hour, staring at a framed photo we kept by the pastry case, the 2 of us on opening day of the flagship location, exhausted and grinning, covered in paint dust. I remember thinking, staring at that photo, that I had 2 choices in front of me. I could let this discovery simply confirm what I already knew, that the marriage was over, and quietly negotiate my way out with as little conflict as possible. Or I could ask a harder question. How much of what I'd helped build had actually been quietly stolen out from under me while I wasn't looking? I took that photo down that same afternoon and put it in a drawer. But I did one thing almost immediately, almost on instinct. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I called a divorce attorney a former staging client of mine had recommended years earlier, a woman named Renata who specialized in cases involving jointly owned small businesses. I remember sitting in her office, sliding a folder across her desk, screenshots, bank statements, the lease, all of it organized by date because some part of me had apparently been building a legal case before I even knew that's what I was doing. Renata looked through everything slowly, methodically, and then she said something that changed the entire trajectory of what came next. She said, "This isn't just an affair. This is marital waste. And depending on how this business account is structured, it might also be something a lot more serious than that." She explained patiently that in our state, when one spouse spends shared or business assets on an affair, hotels, apartments, gifts, courts can factor that dissipation of assets directly into the divorce settlement, often awarding the wronged spouse a larger share specifically to offset what was wasted. But then she said the sentence that really made everything click into place. If any of this money came directly out of the business account and the business is a separate legal entity you co-own, this isn't just marital misconduct anymore. This could be embezzlement from the company itself. Renata spent almost an hour that first meeting walking me through exactly why the structure of the little fig mattered so much here. Because we'd formed it years earlier as an LLC, with Carol holding a small minority stake as an early investor, the business itself was legally a separate entity from our marriage, which meant its finances weren't just subject to divorce proceedings, they were subject to fiduciary duty law. Any co-owner who used company funds for purely personal purposes without authorization from the other owners could be held liable not just in a divorce court, but potentially in a civil suit brought by the company itself or, in extreme cases, referred for criminal investigation. That distinction, personal misconduct versus corporate fraud, was the exact leverage point Renata said we needed to build our entire strategy around. I sat with that sentence for a long time because on one hand, some tired, still grieving part of me just wanted this to be over, wanted a quiet, clean divorce where I got to keep my dignity and move on. But another part of me, a colder, clearer part I didn't fully know I had until that exact moment, understood that Mark had spent almost a year making decisions for both of us without my knowledge or consent, using resources we'd both bled for, and that quiet and clean was never going to feel like justice. It was going to feel like letting him get away with it twice. So I decided I wasn't going to react. I was going to build a case, methodically, the same way I'd once built a business, and I was going to let the truth, backed by documentation, do the talking instead of my anger. Renata recommended a forensic accountant named Diane who specialized in small business divorces, someone who could trace every dollar Mark had moved, categorize it properly, and produce a report that would hold up not just in a divorce proceeding, but potentially in front of the business's own board, which in our case was really just the two of us and a silent minority investor, my aunt, who'd put in early seed money and still held a small stake. Diane spent nearly 6 weeks going through every transaction from the business account for the past 2 years. What she found was worse than even I expected. Mark hadn't just spent money on the affair. He'd been quietly siphoning small, hard-to-notice amounts, a few $100s here, a vendor payment there, into a separate personal account he'd opened without my knowledge, using it to build a cushion for his life after the divorce, one he clearly intended to walk into already financially prepared for, while leaving me to deal with whatever was left of the business's actual operating cash. I remember our first working session together, Diane spreading printouts across her conference table, walking me through her preliminary findings with a kind of clinical calm that, honestly, helped steady me more than any comforting words from a friend could have at that point. She kept saying things like, "This pattern is consistent," and "This is a textbook structuring technique," in the same tone someone might use to describe a broken sprinkler system. And something about her total lack of emotional investment in the situation made the whole thing feel manageable for the first time since I'd found that envelope. She wasn't shocked by what Mark had done. She'd seen it dozens of times before in dozens of other marriages. That, oddly, was a comfort. This was the part that required the most nerve, honestly. I still had to work alongside Mark during this stretch, at least on paper, because neither of us had officially separated business ownership yet. I had to sit in meetings with him, discuss vendor contracts, even green light schedules that included Kayla, all while quietly, carefully working with Renata to freeze what I could freeze and document what I could document before he had any idea the forensic audit existed. I remember one specific meeting, about 3 weeks into this process, where Mark suggested we restructure the business ownership percentages ahead of the divorce, framing it as something reasonable, practical, even generous on his part. I smiled, said I'd think about it, and then went straight to Renata's office afterward because I understood in that moment that he was trying to lock in a favorable ownership split before I found out what Diane's audit was going to reveal. There was another meeting during that stretch about vendor renewals for the second location's coffee supplier, where Mark casually mentioned wanting to move Kayla into a more senior marketing role with expanded budget authority, framing it purely as a business decision about talent retention. I sat across the table and nodded along, agreeing it made sense given her results, all while doing quiet mental math about how much easier that expanded budget authority would have made it for both of them to continue moving money without raising flags, had I not already been quietly building a paper trail of my own. I signed nothing that day. I told him I needed time to think it over, buying myself exactly the kind of delay Renata and Diane needed to finish their work. This is where my aunt, Carol, came back into the picture. Carol had put in early investment money when the little fig was just a business plan on my kitchen table, and she'd always had a quiet, sharp instinct about Mark that she'd never voiced out loud, out of respect for a marriage. When I finally told her what was happening, the affair, the apartment, the siphoned funds, she didn't hesitate for a second. As a minority shareholder, she had every legal right to request her own review of the business's financials, and she formally did, which gave Diane's forensic audit an additional layer of legitimacy that Mark couldn't dismiss as simply an angry wife digging for dirt. I remember the exact moment I told her, sitting across from her at her kitchen table with the same manila folder I'd brought to Renata's office. Carol read through it slowly, her jaw tightening, more with every page. And when she finally looked up, she said, "I've watched that man for 7 years smile at family dinners like he had nothing to hide. I am done being polite about my instincts." She poured us both a glass of wine, set it down without drinking hers, and said, "Tell me exactly what you need from me, and I'll do it." Carol also told me something I hadn't known, that months earlier, Mark had approached her privately, asking if she'd be willing to sell her shares to him directly at a price well below what her stake was actually worth, framing it as helping streamline ownership. She'd said no at the time, mostly out of loyalty to me, without fully understanding why he was suddenly so eager to consolidate control. Looking back, Carol told me, I think he was trying to make sure that whatever happened between the two of you, he'd already have full control of the business locked down before you ever had a chance to question anything. She said she'd felt a little uneasy about the request at the time, but had chalked it up to Mark simply being cautious about the business's long-term structure. Knowing what she knows now, she told me, that uneasy feeling makes a lot more sense. I want to tell you a bit more about Diane's process, because a few people who've heard this story always ask how you actually prove something like this instead of just suspecting it. Diane didn't just look at the withdrawals in isolation. She cross-referenced every questionable charge against our vendor contracts, our tax filings, our point-of-sale system logs, and even the security camera footage from the flagship location's back office, which recorded a timestamp on every entry and exit. Several of the team dinner withdrawals Mark had logged turned out to correspond with nights the footage showed him alone at his desk for less than 10 minutes before leaving the building entirely, nowhere near long enough for the dinner meeting he claimed to have expensed. She built what she called a clean narrative, a simple chronological account of every dollar, no editorializing, just dates, amounts, and cross-referenced evidence. Renata told me early on that judges and mediators respond to exactly that kind of clarity far better than they respond to emotional testimony, and she was right. By the time Diane's report was finished, it read less like an accusation and more like a spreadsheet nobody could argue with. I'll be honest with you, I went back and forth for a while on how public any of this should become. Part of me wanted a quiet, clinical divorce settlement where the numbers simply spoke for themselves behind closed doors and Mark walked away financially gutted without ever fully understanding how thoroughly I'd outmaneuvered him. Another part of me, admittedly, wanted the people in our small business community, the vendors, the regulars, the staff who'd watched us build this thing from nothing, to eventually understand the truth, not out of spite, but because I was tired of being the sad wife who couldn't keep her husband happy in a story people were already quietly starting to whisper about town. I settled on something in between. I decided the legal case would happen exactly the way it needed to, through Renata, through Diane's audit, through mediation, and if necessary, through court. But I also decided that when the Little Fig's 5-year anniversary celebration came around, an event already planned for months, an event Mark, as co-founder, fully expected to attend and be publicly celebrated at, the truth about who actually owned that business by that point would become impossible to hide. I want to be really clear about something here because I know how this can sound from the outside. Everything Diane and Renata helped me build was completely legal, thoroughly documented, and specifically designed to hold up under scrutiny. I wasn't looking to destroy Mark out of spite. I was looking to make sure that the equitable distribution laws in our state actually got applied equitably, given that he'd spent nearly a year quietly stacking the deck in his own favor. Renata prepared me for the very real possibility that Mark's own lawyer might try to argue the business withdrawals were legitimate expenses, poorly labeled but not fraudulent. Diane's report was built specifically to close that loophole, cross-referencing every questionable withdrawal against vendor contracts, tax filings, and even security footage from the flagship location's office. Timestamps that placed Mark alone at his desk during several of the transactions he later tried to claim were team dinners. Renata walked me through worst-case scenarios, including the possibility that Mark might try to counter-accuse me of mismanaging the business myself, or claim I'd known about and tacitly approved certain expenses over the years. Diane's clean, dated timeline made that kind of counter-narrative nearly impossible to sustain, since every withdrawal traced directly back to a period when I had no operational access to that particular account at all. About 2 weeks before the anniversary event, something almost derailed everything. Mark, through his lawyer, sent an aggressive settlement offer that assumed I had no real leverage, an offer that would have left me with a minority stake in the business, a modest payout, and him keeping majority control, alongside a consulting relationship with Kayla built into the new operational structure. For about 48 hours, I genuinely panicked, wondering if Diane and Renata's strategy of waiting for the full forensic picture before responding had cost me the advantage of speed. I remember reading that settlement offer 3 times in a row, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside Renata's office, feeling the old familiar panic creep back in, the fear that somehow, despite everything Diane and Carol and I had built, Mark was going to walk away from this more than his fair share simply because his lawyer had gotten aggressive first. I called Renata almost in tears, asking if we needed to respond immediately, if waiting any longer was going to cost us the advantage. But what happened next, I never saw coming. Renata called me calm as ever and said the aggressive lowball offer was actually the best news we could have gotten. She said, "He's negotiating like a man who doesn't know what we know. That means he still thinks he has the upper hand. Let him keep thinking that a little while longer." She was right. Mark had no idea Diane's audit even existed yet. He had no idea Carol had requested her own shareholder review. He was still operating in a version of this divorce where I was simply the wounded, cooperative wife trying to move on quietly. He had absolutely no idea what was coming at the anniversary event. There was a second near miss, too, one I haven't mentioned yet. That happened just 4 days before the party. Diane, who occasionally coordinated with our bookkeeper to pull updated statements, mentioned offhand to me that the bookkeeper had recently fielded a strange question from Kayla, something about whether old vendor records get archived automatically or if someone would need to go digging for them. I felt my stomach drop reading that message, certain that Kayla had somehow sensed something was being reviewed and was trying to get ahead of it. I called Renata immediately, half convinced we needed to accelerate everything before Mark and Kayla could delete or alter anything further. Renata, calm as always, pointed out that our forensic backups were already secured, time-stamped, and stored independently of the business's live systems. Nothing they could touch at this point would change what Diane's report already showed. "Let them get nervous," she said. "Nervous people make mistakes. Confident people don't." She was right again. Kayla's question, it turned out, was nothing more than ordinary curiosity about the bookkeeping system, completely unconnected to the audit. But it was a reminder in those final days of exactly how close the whole plan still felt to unraveling, even when the foundation underneath it was already rock solid. 2 nights before the anniversary celebration, I sat down with my mom over the phone and told her the full plan start to finish for the first time. I'd kept her mostly in the dark about the details up to that point, partly to protect her from worrying, partly because I think some part of me needed to be sure I was really going to go through with it before saying it out loud to someone who'd worry about me. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, "Your dad would be so proud of how calm you stayed through all of this." That sentence undid me a little, in the best possible way. My dad had always been the practical one growing up, the one who taught me that the loudest person in a negotiation isn't always the one who wins it, and that people who cut corners are usually undone, eventually, by simple, boring, undeniable facts. I thought about him a lot in those final 2 days, and I thought about how strange it was that the thing steadying me as I walked toward that anniversary celebration wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to his voice in the back of my head, patient and sure. The night before the anniversary celebration, I laid out the navy dress I'd bought for the occasion, the printed summary of Diane's forensic report Renata's had prepared for exactly this moment, and a single flash drive with the full documentation just in case. I didn't sleep much, but for the first time since finding that manila envelope, the thing keeping me up wasn't grief, it was readiness. The night of the Lil Fig's 5-year anniversary celebration, I got there early, on purpose. I wanted to see the flagship location decorated the way I'd originally envisioned it years earlier. String lights across the exposed brick, the little reading nook I'd designed myself, the chalkboard wall covered in 5 years of regulars' handwritten memories. I wanted a minute to stand in that space and remember exactly why I'd built it in the first place before I became the reason everyone in that room would remember this particular anniversary for years to come. I'd spent the past few months doing something I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did, taking care of myself, not in some dramatic made-for-TV way. I'd started running again, something I hadn't done since college. I'd gotten a haircut I actually wanted instead of one that was low maintenance. I'd started sleeping again, actually sleeping for the first time in almost a year. When I looked in the mirror that night, in a navy dress I'd bought for myself with my own money, I recognized the woman looking back at me for the first time in a long time. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters for anyone watching this who's in the thick of their own version of this story right now. The glow up, if you want to call it that, wasn't really about the haircut or the dress or the 5 pounds I'd lost from actually eating regular meals again. It was about the fact that for the first time in nearly a year, I was making decisions based on what I wanted, not on managing someone else's moods, someone else's secrets, someone else's slow unraveling of a life I thought we were building together. Standing in front of that mirror that night, I realized the calm I felt wasn't about looking good for an audience. It was about finally, quietly belonging to myself again. Guests started arriving, regular customers, vendors, our small staff, a few local business owners we'd built relationships with over the years. I saw Mark near the espresso bar, laughing with a vendor rep, wearing a blazer that still had the fold creases in it, clearly bought for tonight. Kayla stood next to him, in a dress that looked expensive in the specific way of someone still learning what that word means, her hand resting lightly on his arm the way mine used to. Mark saw me across the room, and I watched something flicker across his face. Not quite alarm, more like the mild, misplaced confidence of a man who genuinely believed he still held all the cards. He came over about 10 minutes in, all easy smiles, and said, "You look great, really great." I said thank you, because I did, and because I'd earned that compliment on my own terms, not his. He mentioned almost casually that his lawyer said we were close to wrapping things up and that he hoped we could keep things friendly for the sake of the business and the staff who depended on it. I told him I hoped so too. I meant it in a way he wouldn't understand until about 20 minutes later. Kayla approached me separately about 5 minutes after that, holding a glass of Prosecco, clearly trying to strike a casual, friendly tone. "This place looks amazing tonight," she said. "You always did have the best eye for this stuff." I thanked her, genuinely, because the compliment was true even coming from her. She lingered a moment longer, then added almost carefully, "I hope, whatever happens with everything, we can all still be professional about it. This place means a lot to me, too." I remember looking at her for a beat too long before I said, simply, "I think tonight's going to make a lot of things very clear for everyone." She smiled a little uncertainly and excused herself toward the bar. I watched her walk away and felt, for just a moment, something almost like pity. She was 26, standing in a room full of people who'd known Mark and me for years, wearing a dress bought with money that, according to Diane's report, hadn't entirely been hers to spend either. I don't think she understood in that moment just how much her own life was about to change alongside his. Around 8 p.m., my Aunt Carol stepped up near the small stage we'd set up for toasts, tapping her glass gently, the traditional call for everyone's attention. The room quieted, phones came out to record the anniversary toast, and Carol began, warm and easy, the way she always spoke in public. 5 years ago, this business started as a dream between two people who believed they could build something meaningful together, she said. And I remember watching Mark's face soften slightly, clearly expecting a familiar celebratory toast. That's when I stepped up next to Carol. I want to describe what that walk felt like, those few steps from where I'd been standing near the back of the small crowd to the front of that little stage, because I've thought about it more than almost any other moment in this entire story. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 10 feet, but it felt like the culmination of every quiet, careful, methodical decision I'd made over the past several months. Every document I'd photographed, every meeting I'd sat through with a calm face, every night I'd spent lying awake rehearsing exactly how I wanted this moment to go. By the time I reached Carol's side, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was simply ready. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't make a scene. I simply said, calm and clear, "Before we celebrate 5 years, I think everyone in this room deserves to understand exactly what the next 5 are actually going to look like." The room turned toward me the way rooms do in moments like this. First confusion, then a slow dawning unease as people started to sense something had shifted. Mark's smile faltered. Kayla's hand slipped off his arm. "The little fig has always been something I'm incredibly proud of," I said, "and I want to be transparent with everyone here tonight because most of you have supported this business since day one, and you deserve the truth instead of rumors." I looked at Mark directly for the first time all night. Over the past year, a forensic audit of this business's finances uncovered a pattern of undocumented withdrawals totaling just over $90,000 used to fund a personal relationship that began while our company's marketing coordinator was still in her probationary period. Gasps rippled through the room. I heard someone's glass clink too hard against a table near the back. I kept going, steady, because I knew if I stopped, the moment would slip away. "As of this week," I continued, "as part of our divorce settlement, I will retain full ownership of the Little Fig, both locations, effective immediately. Mark will be stepping down from any operational or ownership role in the business." Mark found his voice first, the way people in this position always seem to. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, his voice tight, clearly trying to keep his composure in front of the vendors and regulars watching. "This is a private legal matter. This isn't the—" "You're right that a business's finances are usually private," I said, cutting in, still calm. "But when nearly $100,000 of shared company money funds someone else's engagement announcement before our divorce was even finalized, I think the people who've supported this place for 5 years have earned the right to know why the ownership structure is changing." That detail, the engagement announcement, landed hard across the room. I watched a few of our longtime regulars' faces shift from confusion to something closer to real anger on my behalf. Kayla, who'd been standing frozen since I started speaking, finally spoke, her voice shaking. "We didn't use company money for anything like that. That's not—" "There's an itemized forensic report with your name and Mark's name on transactions dating back 14 months, I said without raising my voice. "I'm happy to share it with anyone who wants to see it. I'm not asking anyone here to just take my word for it." A few more voices rose up in that stretch before Carol spoke, and I think they're worth mentioning because they show how quickly a room turns once the truth is finally allowed room to breathe. One of our earliest vendors, a local roaster we'd worked with since our very first month in business, said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "I always wondered why the equipment budget kept shrinking every quarter." Another regular, an older woman who'd been coming in every Sunday morning for 4 years, murmured to the friend beside her, "This is exactly why I never fully trusted that girl at the register," clearly meaning Kayla, quiet enough that I only caught it because I was standing close. Mark's own father, who'd flown in for the celebration, looked at his son with an expression I can only describe as devastated confusion, the look of a man realizing, in front of everyone he'd come to celebrate with, that he didn't know his son nearly as well as he thought he did. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. Mark didn't answer right away. That hesitation in front of his own father told the room everything it needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Mark finally found his footing enough to try one more angle. "Even if some of this is accurate," he said, his voice tight, scanning the room like he was searching for allies, "this is a business decision being made unilaterally without proper board discussion, and I intend to challenge that legally." I let him finish, then I said calmly, "You're welcome to challenge it, but I'd encourage you to read the full forensic report first, because right now you're the one at risk of a criminal referral, not me." A few people near the front audibly gasped at that. I watched something in Mark's expression finally, fully crack. Here's the part I genuinely didn't plan, the twist I promised you back at the beginning of tonight's story. My Aunt Carol, standing beside me, cleared her throat and added something I hadn't asked her to say. "I also want to add, as a minority shareholder in this business, that I formally requested my own independent review of these finances weeks ago, separate from the divorce proceedings entirely. The findings match Diane's report exactly. This isn't a spurned wife's accusation. This is a documented, verified pattern of financial misconduct against a company I helped fund from its very first day." I want to be clear about something here. I didn't plan for Carol's independent review to become public knowledge at this exact moment in this exact way. I'd planned to reveal the ownership change and let the financial facts stand on their own. But betrayal, I've learned, has a strange gravity to it. Once one piece of the truth becomes undeniable in a room, the rest tends to surface right alongside it because everyone involved has spent so long managing separate lies that they can't keep them straight once the room stops cooperating. What happened over the next several minutes was something no script could have written better. A few vendors quietly excused themselves, phones still recording. One of our longest-standing regulars, an older man who'd been coming in for coffee every single morning since our very first week, walked directly up to me and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "This place has always felt like it had real heart behind it. Glad to know exactly whose heart that was." Mark's own father, who'd flown in for the anniversary, who had always gotten along with, pulled him aside near the exit, and I overheard just enough to know it wasn't a comforting conversation. Kayla left within minutes, walking out alone, her expensive-looking dress suddenly looking a lot less certain on her. I remember one more small moment from those chaotic minutes. One of our youngest baristas, barely 21, standing near the pastry case with tears in her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with sadness for me. She came over quietly and said, "I've worked here for 2 years and I never once thought something like this could be happening right under all our noses." I told her the business wasn't going anywhere, that her job was safe, that this was about accountability, not about the place itself falling apart. She nodded, still a little shaken, and asked if I needed help getting people their coats. That kind of steady, practical kindness from someone who barely knew me meant more to me that night than I think she'll ever fully understand. I found out in the weeks that followed that Kayla's engagement announcement draft, the one with the date timed 6 weeks after our divorce was supposed to finalize, never got posted. Word travels fast in a small business community, and it turns out very few 26-year-olds are eager to publicly announce an engagement to a man who just lost his half of a business, his professional reputation, and very nearly avoided a criminal referral only by signing over his ownership stake in full. That last part is worth explaining because it's the piece that actually settled everything. Renata, my lawyer, had structured the final settlement so that Mark had a choice: sign over his full ownership stake in the Little Fig immediately, along with a significantly reduced share of our other joint assets to account for the dissipated funds, or risk Carol and me formally referring the documented embezzlement to the appropriate authorities as a separate matter from the divorce entirely. He signed within 4 days. I don't think he ever seriously considered the alternative once he understood how thoroughly documented everything actually was. Renata told me later that Mark's own lawyer had apparently spent most of those 4 days trying to talk him into fighting it, arguing that a judge might view some of the withdrawals more sympathetically given how long the marriage had lasted. But once Mark's lawyer actually sat down with the full report, the vendor cross-references, the time-stamped office footage, the florist charge tied directly to Kayla's apartment address, even he seemed to understand there wasn't a version of this fight worth having. Renata said the final call from his lawyer's office was almost apologetic in tone, which she told me almost never happens in cases like this. I also got a message from Mark's father about 5 days after the anniversary party that I still think about often. He didn't try to defend his son. He didn't ask me to reconsider anything I'd said or done that night. He simply wrote, "I raised him better than this, and somewhere along the way I clearly missed something important. I'm sorry you had to be the one to pay for that." I didn't know how to respond to that for almost a full day. Eventually, I just wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you'd think." We haven't spoken since, but I think about that message often. I kept the house, I kept both locations of the Little Fig fully under my name alone. I received a settlement that accounted for every dollar of marital waste Diane's audit uncovered. And Mark, as far as I know, moved 2 states away about 3 months later, alone, working for someone else's coffee chain this time, in a role several levels below the one he used to hold at the business he helped build and then quietly tried to steal. I want to take you out of that anniversary celebration now and into the months that came after, because I think the quiet rebuilding matters just as much as the dramatic moment everyone remembers. The morning after the anniversary, I woke up in the house I now owned outright, and for the first time in almost a year, I didn't reach for my phone with that familiar knot of dread in my stomach. I just lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling something quieter than happiness, something closer to solid ground. I want to be honest with you, because I don't want this story to end with some tidy bow that makes it seem like winning a settlement automatically fixes everything. It didn't. I still had hard days after that anniversary party. I still, for months afterward, caught myself reaching for his side of the bed out of habit or setting the table for 2 before remembering. Healing isn't a light switch. It's slower than that, messier than that. But what that night gave me, and this is the part I want you to really hold on to, was the truth, finally living out loud instead of quietly eating away at me in private. For almost a year, I'd carried the slow, creeping suspicion that something was wrong, and I'd talked myself out of it every single time, because trusting the people closest to you is supposed to be the safe choice. That night, I stopped being the only person who knew the full truth, and once it was out in the open, I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I also started therapy about a month after the anniversary party, something I probably should have started the night I found that manila envelope, honestly. My therapist, a calm, direct woman named Dr. Alvarez, said something in one of our early sessions that stuck with me, the same way Renata's advice about documentation had. She said, "You're allowed to have built a very smart, very effective plan and still need to grieve the marriage underneath it. Those 2 things aren't in competition with each other." I don't think I fully understood what she meant until months later, sitting alone in my new living room, finally able to cry about the marriage itself instead of just the financial betrayal layered on top of it. In the weeks after the anniversary party, something unexpected happened. Business at the Little Fig actually picked up. I don't think that was a coincidence. People in our town had watched Mark and me build that place together for years, and I think a lot of our regulars felt a quiet kind of relief seeing the truth come out plainly instead of continuing to whisper half versions of it over their morning coffee. A few new customers told me directly that they started coming specifically because they respected how I'd handled the whole thing, calmly, factually, without turning myself into the villain of my own story. I also want to tell you about Carol because she deserves more than a footnote here. In the months after everything settled, she and I got closer than we'd ever been, working side by side on the business in a way that felt collaborative instead of just familial. She told me once over coffee at the flagship location that she'd always had a quiet unease about Mark, but never wanted to say anything that might strain our marriage. She said, "I've regretted staying quiet for years about smaller things with other people. I wasn't going to make that mistake again with you." That conversation reminded me how much silence, however well-intentioned, can cost the people we love, and how grateful I was that she chose not to stay quiet this time. About 8 months after the anniversary party, I ran into Mark completely by accident at a hardware store of all places, back in town visiting his father. It was brief, a little awkward, over in under a minute. He said he was sorry, genuinely, I think, this time without an audience to perform for. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and I meant it. But I also told him I didn't need his apology anymore because I'd already made peace with the version of him I thought I married. The man standing in that hardware store was by then mostly a stranger to me. That felt like its own kind of quiet victory. Not bitterness, just distance. If there's one thing I want you to take away from tonight's story, it's this. The truth doesn't need you to scream it to be powerful. The most devastating thing I ever did to the man who betrayed me wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simply refusing to let his version of events be the only one that got told, and refusing to let him walk away from something we built together with more than his fair share, just because he assumed I'd be too heartbroken to check the math. For almost a year, Mark made decisions about our shared life and our shared business without my knowledge or consent, betting that grief would keep me too distracted to notice. Standing on that small stage and handing the truth to a room full of people who'd supported us for years wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense people usually mean. It was simply me taking back the one thing he'd tried to steal from me twice. First, my trust, then my fair share of everything we'd built. I want to fast forward for you just for a minute to about a year after that anniversary party, because I think the 1 year later version of the story matters just as much as the night itself. A year later, I was standing in the third location of the Little Fig on opening day, watching a line of customers wrap around the block for a business that 24 months earlier, I genuinely wasn't sure I'd managed to keep at all. I'd redesigned the interior myself, top to bottom, incorporating little touches that had always been mine originally, back before Mark's more cautious instincts had talked me out of half of them over the years. It felt, in a strange way, like getting a piece of my own creative voice back, not just the business itself. I remember standing behind the counter that opening morning, watching my sister and Carol both show up early just to help however they could, neither of them needing to be asked. At one point, Carol leaned over and whispered, "He would have hated this design, you know," gesturing at the bold, unapologetic color palette I'd finally allowed myself to use. I laughed genuinely for what felt like the first time in ages and said, "I know, that's exactly why I picked it." I also want to tell you what happened to a few of the people on the edges of this story, because a few of you have asked in comments on other videos what happens to the extras once the cameras, so to speak, stop rolling. Carol and I are closer now than we've ever been. She comes in most mornings for coffee, and we've started talking seriously about expanding to a fourth location together. Diane, the forensic accountant, actually became a semi-regular customer, and we joke a little darkly about how unusual our working relationship was compared to her typical clients. Renata still handles legal matters for the business, and I've referred at least 3 other women in similar situations to her over the past 2 years. My sister, who picked up the phone at 3 a.m. the night I found that lease, still calls me every single Sunday, a habit we started during the worst of it that neither of us felt like breaking. That young barista who helped me with coats the night of the anniversary party is now our assistant manager at the flagship location, and I think about that small kindness of hers more often than she probably realizes. I heard secondhand, about 18 months after everything happened, that Mark and Kayla's relationship didn't survive much past the 6-month mark following the anniversary party. I won't pretend I didn't feel a small, petty flicker of satisfaction hearing that. But mostly, now, I just feel a kind of distant, settled peace about the whole thing. Some patterns, I've come to understand, tend to repeat themselves regardless of how badly the people caught in them want to believe this time will be different. That's not something I actively root for anymore. It's just something I've made peace with as simply true. I'm doing well now, almost 2 years later. The Little Fig opened a third location last spring, something I never would have attempted with Mark still involved, honestly, because so much of our old dynamic had quietly been built around his caution holding back my bigger ideas. I started dating again recently, nothing serious yet, just enough to remember that trust, given carefully and rebuilt slowly, is still possible. I don't regret how I handled any of it, not for a second. I regret trusting someone who spent nearly a year making decisions for both of us behind my back. I regret not asking harder questions the night I caught that flicker on his face at the second location. I regret every quiet moment I talked myself out of a suspicion that turned out to be completely justified. But I don't regret staying calm, building my case methodically, and letting documentation do what my anger alone never could have done as effectively. Here's what I've learned, and I want to leave you with this. The people who betray you are usually counting on your heartbreak to make you careless. They're counting on you being too devastated, too exhausted, too eager to move on quickly to actually check the numbers, read the fine print, or ask the hard questions. Don't give them that. You don't have to be cold or vengeful. You just have to be thorough and patient and willing to let the truth do the heavy lifting instead of your anger. I know some of you watching tonight are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story right now. Maybe you just found your own manila envelope. Maybe you're staring at a shared business account, wondering if the numbers ever quite added up. Maybe you're sitting in a guest room right now, still hoping this is just a rough patch. I want to say something directly to you if that's where you are tonight. You don't have to have your whole plan figured out today. You don't need a lawyer's number ready or a forensic accountant on speed dial or a 5-year anniversary party to aim for. All you have to do right now is exactly what my mom told me. Get through today. Document what you can, safely, if you're able to, ask for help from someone you trust, and give yourself permission to grieve something real, even if it turns out the life you were grieving wasn't quite what you thought it was. The plan can come later when you're ready for it. The only wrong move is staying quiet because you think silence is easier than the truth. That's the whole story, from a coffee shop expo conversation to a 5-year anniversary celebration where the truth finally got to speak for itself. If you made it this far with me tonight, genuinely, thank you. Stories like this aren't always easy to tell, and I know for some of you, they might hit closer to home than you expected tonight. I want to know what you would have done in my position. Would you have handled the business side the way I did? Would you have gone public at the anniversary or kept things quiet and private? Drop it in the comments because I read every single one, and some of your stories are honestly just as wild as mine. If tonight's story kept you company, do me a favor and subscribe because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Real betrayals, real consequences, and real endings that actually feel like justice for once. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.